thank you so much for welcoming us to your house. You are such an interesting example of an American Jew who moved to Israel, which you did with your wife as a young couple after the Six-Day War, shortly thereafter. And then you wrote a book in the 70s that was influential for many of us, including me, but a whole generation or two of American Jews. It was called Letters to an American Jewish Friend. And you were explaining to your counterparts in the United States who are committed Jews your view of the future of the Jewish people. Now, looking forward 40-some years, a year after...
Close to 50.
Close to 50, isn't it? Yeah, it was published in 77, so yeah, right? Close to 50 years later. How would you write this book now if you were sitting down?
I wouldn't write it.
Really?
I wouldn't write it. Not because I don't think that what I wrote was correct or true. I would still stand by 90% of it, maybe more. But I wouldn't, emotionally, I wouldn't have the incentive to write it. And I think I wrote it partly in the naive belief that it could have even more of an effect than it did. It affected individuals, you know.
Yeah.
But I really thought, and I say this was very naive of me, that it could help start some kind of real Zionist discourse or dialogue, a debate in the United States among American Jews.
Yes.
And it never did, of course. And, you know, it strikes me now that how ironic it is in 2024 when American Jews are, for the first time really in history, certainly the first time since the 1930s, living in fear to an extent, living with a president that most of them detest, living with great worry about their future, personal future, and the future of the American Jewish community. Right. The subject of Israel, of moving to Israel, is just not, it's not part of it. You know, they'll move to Argentina before they'll move to Israel. Many of them, most of them. And that's how much Zionism has failed, really, to be part of the American Jewish intellectual scene, and has failed to have an impact, really.
I just want to read from the second edition of your book, Letters to an American Jewish Friend. What is the classical statement of Zionism? When you wrote this in 2013, the second edition, so it wasn't that long ago. Yeah. You were saying that your argument is not with the millions of American Jews for whom Judaism and their Jewishness is not a top priority. It's just one of the things that they identify with. But you were talking about the really committed American Jews, and you were asking them to be honest. You say the honesty to face a historical situation and draw the right conclusions, that the state of Israel was the only meaningful future of the Jewish people, that this state's existence could only be assured by Jews living in it, and therefore the most meaningful place for a Jewish life to be lived is in Israel. Do you still believe that?
Yes, absolutely. At a time when on the one hand you have a Jewish state, you know, with all its faults and weaknesses, and on the other hand you have a diaspora that, as I said, is I think fading away, all except for its, because the only people in the diaspora who are really holding their own and are going to be able to are, you know, Orthodox or semi-Orthodox Jews. Who would also be, of course, the ones who would be most comfortable settling in Israel. It just makes no sense for somebody who says, you know, being Jewish is terribly important to me, or is one of my first priorities, to be living there and not here. It's an evasion of historical responsibility, if you want to put it that way. Should all Jews come to live in Israel? Well, no. I mean, obviously, many of them would not. This would not be the right country for many of them. I don't think that's a viable argument. You know, that if all American Jews go to Israel, it's going to weaken support for Israel. Because first of all, they're not going to go.
Right.
Second of all, I doubt whether Jewish support for Israel is that important anymore. It's getting less and less important, I think. partly because demographically the Jews are losing their centrality. Partly because the Jewish community now itself is more split than ever. I mean, so you can't really speak of a Jewish, any kind of monolithic Jewish support for Israel.
What would you say then? I mean, one of the major differences from nearly 50 years ago when you wrote this is the presence of a large, let's call it anti-Zionist element in the Jewish community. They certainly get a lot of press in the U.S.
Right.
I mean, that didn't exist in the mid-'70s so much.
It didn't exist in the mid-'70s. It existed in the 1910s and 20s and the 1890s and so on. And I think a lot of it really is a reincarnation of left, communist or left socialist opposition, Bundist opposition to Zionism that was very, very strong all along, and that kind of went underground or was temporarily silenced with the foundation of Israel. But somehow was always waiting for an opportunity to revive, and all of Israel's failings now have enabled it to revive.
So they have a point, you think? The criticism from the left in the U.S. community?
You can be you can have correct criticism coming from the incorrect person. And yes, sure, much of the criticism is correct. The people making it are on the whole scoundrels and hypocrites and liars, but it doesn't make some of their criticism any less valid. It's just I would rather hear that criticism come from people who love Israel rather than from people who hate it.
Challenging times in the US and also in Israel for liberals, for people who would want to see more freedom of speech, freedom of expression. What do you think the day brings for Israel now with the new American administration, and how it will reflect on our politics here?
Israel has a short-term problem and a long-term problem. About the short-term problem, I'm perhaps more optimistic than many people. About the long-term problem, I think I'm much more pessimistic. There are going to be elections here in 2 years. If you tell that to many Israelis on the left, and they say, "Oh, you're kidding yourself. What kind of election? There won't be any elections." The Likud will stage a coup long before that, or they'll find a way to call off the elections. And I don't really believe that that's going to happen. I don't think it's possible. Now, and in those elections, by all indications, Netanyahu and the Likud and his coalition will lose. So, I think we can hold out another 2 years. More and more damage will be inflicted in the course of those 2 years. But I think this country can hold out for another 2 years until elections. If by any chance Netanyahu should win the 26 elections, then, I think all bets are off. I would...
But don't you think that irreversible changes can happen over the course of these 2 years? And I'm speaking about legislation that damages the fabric of the state and represses perhaps their votes and.
I think tremendous damage can be done, but I think if you look around you at the world, you see how countries can recover from maybe even worse damage than we envision in Israel, as opposed to the rhetoric. It's done a lot, but it does it all on a semi-clandestine or on a paralegal basis. It doesn't legally annex anything, hardly. What is it? It annexed Jerusalem in 1967, and it annexed the Golan in 1981, I think it was, and it stopped there.
Right.
A, because it knows it can't get away with it, and B, because it doesn't... I don't know what Rich thinks. I don't think he's probably very smart. But if he did think, he'd realize that from his point of view, the worst thing he can do is annex this. Because the minute he annexes, he's got millions and millions of Palestinians who he's got to decide what he's going to do with their citizenship. Either he denies them citizenship, and then we become officially an apartheid state, which in many ways unofficially we're becoming anyway. or he gives them citizenship, and then we're already living in a full binational state. I was always more or less pro-settlement. It always seemed to me that Jews not only should have the right, but should implement the right to live in Eretz Yisrael. And it seemed always outrageous to me that anyone would deny them that right. And it always seemed to me, and I was wrong, that the point would be reached at which it would be possible to create two states, a Palestinian and a Jewish state, a Jewish state with many Palestinian Arabs living in it, and a Palestinian state with many Jews living in it. And it seemed to me that was inevitably going to be what would happen. It would be the only rational solution and the only moral solution to the problem. But even if it was ever possible, and it probably wasn't, I mean, we've missed that train. It's no longer possible because you just you could not muster the support for it in Israel. You probably couldn't muster the support for it among Palestinians. The hatred between the two people is so great now. October 7th made me say to myself, this just can't go on like this anymore. Can't go on like this anymore. You know, any illusion that we could, contain this thing, or that we could manage it, I mean, to use a much used word, I think was foolish even before October 7th, but I mean, in my opinion, it was just totally exploded by October 7th. And it became, it was just clear to me that, that we cannot, if we're going to live by our swords, we'll die in the end by our swords. We cannot hold out forever in this part of the world against, 100 million or whatever Arabs and a billion or 2 billion Muslims. We can't. We can do it for a decade, we can do it for 5 decades, we can do it 10, we can't do it indefinitely. We'll go under partly because our own population will not be able to take it anymore.
You have a column, I think you're still doing it, the philologist column that you write.
Yes, I write it every 2 weeks.
I love it. And, but first question, there's a huge literature that you've helped raise up again from over 100 years ago of early Zionist literature. Who's your favorite of that period? Who would you recommend for someone to pick up and read now that's still relevant to all these problems we've discussed?
I don't know if I have any one favorite. All of the authors I discuss in my book, The Lady of Hebrew and Her Lovers of Zion, which you referred to before.
Yeah.
They're all authors I love. And I think you really, if you really want to know where we've come from and where Zionism has come from, you have to know these authors.
Right.
It's the literature of a people that tells you the most about it, much more than its politics ultimately.
You referred to the debate between Ahad Ha'am and Berdichevsky's followers.
Ahad Ha'am and Berdichevsky, and Ahad Ha'am and Herzl.
Yeah. Political Zionism versus cultural Zionism, and those issues are still
when you said that many people can't agree on, what Zionism is about, many Zionists can't agree on what Zionism is about.
Yeah.
Right.
Because Zionism, it was never an ideology in the sense of like Marxism as an ideology. It was partly more of a sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I would always say, Zionism was more the Jewish will to live than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And that will to live expressed itself in many different forms.
Mm.
The Zionist that I think I most admire to this day, and partly because I wrote a biography of him, is Jabotinsky, who I think is an extraordinary figure and intellectually stands head and shoulders almost above all his colleagues, and some of them stood high themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's a language question as we end. I actually asked you this as in your role as philologist, and I got a partial answer, but I'm going to ask it more precisely. Going back to the Bible, there's the famous saying, love your neighbor as yourself. In Hebrew, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha.
Right.
Who is reacha? Who are the neighbors? Are they only Jews? Or is reacha? Is this more of a universalistic statement? Or
Well,
is
there's a
this
debate about that
somewhere
within Judaism itself.
Right. Yeah. Where do you come out on that?
Personally,
Yeah.
well, I'm always for I'm on the universalistic side here, I think. I mean, part of my quarrel with Judaism is that the universalists have generally not been able to carry the day in the Jewish world or with Jewish tradition, which is another subject in its own right. But I mean, partly of what's happened with me is that I have become more in recent years, and I mean, certainly since the current government took power, I've become more and more, well, anti-Jewish isn't quite the word for it, but I've become, my feelings about Judaism, which is a religion I grew up in. I grew up in an Orthodox home, and there's a great, I know my Judaism very well.
Yeah.
And there's much that I love about it, but it's a religion I'm feeling angrier and angrier about.
But finally, going back to reacha, I mean, we can interpret it in modern times, but how was it seen originally, do you think? Is reacha?
Look, first of all, at the time that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha was stated, I think there were probably not yet any Jews and non-Jews. It was the whole thing was more amorphous than that.
Yeah.
There were maybe Israelites,
Right.
but you could become an Israelite like Naomi does by simply you settle in Bethlehem and your children are Israelites.
Right.
You didn't have to sit before a board of rabbis.
Right.
And I think reacha has that sense. Reacha is, it's your neighbor, it's your person who's next to you, it's close to you, the person you deal with in your everyday life. It's not an ethnic category.